Hi, this is Ron Sipsik. This is the first in a three-part series on consumer choice. Our objective in this series is to look at how consumers make choices in a world of scarcity, specifically with fixed budgets and fixed prices. And we're going to look at how ultimately a consumer arrives at the combination of goods and services that make that consumer most happy. We begin with a simple example, a two-product model, where a buyer is considering the purchase of coffee and rolls. This buyer has $10, and that's what the buyer will have every morning to purchase either coffee or rolls or some combination of both products. Our first task in this problem is to figure out what are the buyer's consumption options. The buyer has $10, the price of coffee is $2, the price of roll is $1. So we can see that if the buyer has $10, the buyer could buy as much as 5 coffees for breakfast. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 coffees are all options. Notice, however, that as the buyer consumes more coffee, the buyer has to give up rolls. It's either or. To spend money on coffee is to not spend money on rolls. If the buyer were to spend no money on coffee and all the money on rolls, the buyer could have 10 rolls, 10 divided by $1. But every time the buyer buys a coffee, the buyer must give up 2 rolls. So we see that as we go down the table, we add 1 to the coffee column, we have to deduct 2 from the roll column, and we get a table that shows us the consumption possibilities. Notice here that 1 coffee equals 2 rolls. So 2 rolls is really what we would call the opportunity cost of consuming 1 coffee. Remember, the price is not the true cost of a product. The dollars spent on a product do not represent the true cost. The buyer is after something good that gives them value. Money is like tickets. You don't go to the movie theater to buy the tickets. You go to the movie theater to see the movie. You don't go to the coffee shop or the breakfast shop to simply lay your money out on the table and look at it. You go there to translate that money into coffee or rolls, and those products provide you with value. So 1 coffee really costs the buyer 2 rolls. 1 roll costs the buyer 1/2 coffee. These numbers represent the opportunity cost, the numbers that are circled. So we can see here in the table that there are 6 possible combinations that the buyer can choose from. The question becomes, which of these combinations is optimal for this buyer? We're going to go ahead and put these combinations on our graph here. We'll be using this graph throughout the analysis. This graph actually has a name. It's called a budget line. And what does a budget line show? It shows all of the combinations of 2 products that can be purchased with a fixed budget. So if this buyer puts all of his money into coffee, he can have 5 coffee. If he puts all of his money into rolls, he can have 10 rolls. He could also have combinations in between. For instance, he could have 4 coffee and he could have 2 rolls. He could have 3 coffee, or he could have 3 coffee and 4 rolls, or he could have 2 coffee and he could have 6 rolls. We see that now we're going down the coffee column. As he gives up a coffee, what's happening here? He can have 2 more rolls. The last option inside the extremes would be 1 coffee and 8 rolls. So these are the 6 combinations that we talked about in our table. And the question now becomes, which of these 6 combinations is optimal for our buyer? Well, we don't have enough information to decide that. At this point, all we know are the options the buyer has. We don't know which option is going to make this buyer most happy. So we have to introduce some more information into the analysis. So I'm going to set up another little table here. Quantity, marginal utility of coffee, and then marginal, that should be a U, excuse me, marginal utility of coffee, marginal utility of rolls. Now, some definitions are in order here. What do we mean by marginal utility? Well, the term utility means value or satisfaction. Every buyer is looking to take money and translate that money into utility, value that will make that buyer happy. So utility is simply an economic term for value or satisfaction. Marginal utility refers to the utility a buyer gets from a specific unit. So let's say that for unit 1 of coffee, the buyer would get 860 utils. These are utils, units of satisfaction, units of utility. Let's say the first roll would give the buyer 500 utils. Question, which of these two units would the buyer want to buy? So the first money spent could be either spent on coffee or on rolls. What is the buyer going to do here? Well, it looks like the buyer would want to buy coffee because coffee gives more utility. But keep in mind that this is really $8.60 per what? Per $2. Whereas this is $500 per dollar. And if we look at this, we would actually see that $8.60 per 2 is really what? $4.30 per dollar. And it would actually be better for the buyer to buy the first roll. So the point is, when we do this problem, we're going to have to convert, I'll write it over here, we have to adjust these marginal utility numbers that are given. Marginal utility divided by price equals marginal utility per what? Per dollar. And this is the number we're really after. This is the goal of buyers, to maximize this. Buyers seek to maximize their marginal utility per dollar. And we'll see that in the problem. All right, well, let's continue to put some more numbers in our table. 2, 3, 4, 5. Let me go down 6 units. 6, and then I'm going to plug some more numbers in here. These are just given: 800, 720, 620, 500, 360, and then 480, 420, 360, 280, 180. Now, we see something very interesting here in the table. The buyer is experiencing the law of diminishing marginal utility. The buyer does not get as much happiness from subsequent units of coffee. So the first coffee makes the buyer quite happy, second coffee makes the buyer less happy, third coffee even less happy. Now this buyer has a very strong preference for coffee because this buyer is still getting 360 utils on the 6th cup, and this is at one sitting. So to be able to drink 6 cups of coffee and still say that that 6th cup of coffee tasted pretty good, that means that you got a very strong taste for coffee. Likewise, this buyer has a very strong taste for rolls. I mean, this buyer can buy 6 rolls and still say, yeah, that roll did something for me. If I ate 6 rolls at one sitting, I'd probably need a stomach pump. And you know, you'd need to probably take me to the hospital. I couldn't eat 6 rolls at one sitting. I don't consider that a badge of dishonor, though. All right, anyway, so these numbers have to be divided by 2 because the price is 2. These numbers are okay because they're already expressed in dollars here. But just so we remember this, I'll make a note that these numbers are per dollar. These numbers are per $2. In fact, it might help us to just take a moment and to adjust these MUs. Let's take 860 per 2 and make that what? 430 per 1. Let's take 800 per 2 and make that 400 per 1, and so on. 360 per 1, 310 per 1, 250 per 1, 180 per 1. So now, once we've got these expressed as MUs per dollar, we're in a position to make a comparison here. Let me get a different color going so we can see this. Now let's look, should the buyer buy the first coffee or the first roll? Well, 500 per dollar is better than 430 per dollar. So the buyer is going to consume the first roll first. Then the buyer will be on the second roll and the first coffee. Remember, you can't drink the second coffee till you've drunk the first. So we're comparing the second roll to the first coffee. Again, this buyer would buy a roll because 480 per dollar is better than 430 per dollar. You go, well, I would never do that. Well, your MUs clearly don't match these MUs then. You don't have the same preferences this buyer has. This buyer is now going to consider 420 per dollar against 430 per dollar, and now the buyer will buy the first coffee. So the first coffee will be consumed. Now it's either the second coffee, 400 per dollar, or a third roll, 420 per dollar. The buyer is back to rolls. The fourth roll, 360 per dollar against the second coffee, 400 per dollar. The buyer would choose the second coffee. So you can start to see the pattern here. Assign the money where it gives you the most MU per dollar, and that's how people behave. Now, I imagine you don't sit down every month and write out a table for everything you want to buy and try to estimate your MUs for that and do this calculation. But I would submit to you that you do actually think when you spend money, where will this make me most happy? Now back to our problem here, we see that we've got an interesting choice on this next one because 720 per 2 is 360 per dollar, which is equal to 360 per dollar. So in this case, the buyer could go and get another roll, come back and get the coffee, or get the coffee, come back and get the roll, and that's where the problem is going to end here. Because, and of course we'll cross both of those out because they've been consumed. Why does the buyer stop at this point? Well, the buyer has spent $6 on 3 rolls. Remember, 3 rolls are $2 a piece, $6. The buyer has spent $4 on 4 rolls. So 6 plus 4 is $10. The buyer is out of budget, out of income for breakfast. So 3 coffee, 4 rolls is what we would call the optimal consumption combination. Why? That combination maximizes total utility. Now, total utility is not marginal utility. Total utility is a buyer's total satisfaction from their budget. So total utility is the sum of the MUs. So if we go back up to our table, what do we see? We see that the buyer consumed the first 3 coffee, 860, 800, 720. If you add up those numbers, those first 3 coffees, let me set up a little table here so we can see this. If you take 3 coffee, 4 rolls, we'll put a column here, TU, 3 coffee would give us 860 plus 800 plus 720 of utils. That would add up to 2380. Okay, 2380. So 2380 is the total utility for 3 coffee. Take the first 4 rolls, 500, 480, 420, 360. Add up the MUs for the first 4 rolls, you're going to actually get 1760. If you add up the MUs for the first 4 rolls, you get 1760. Add up the first 3 coffee MUs, you get 2380. Total those, 4140. 4140 is going to be the maximum total utility for this buyer. How do we know that? This buyer always spent $1 where that buyer got the most satisfaction. So if we come back up to our budget line, if we come back up here to the budget line, let me switch the colors here. Let's go to red. What point on this budget line is optimal? It's 3 coffee, 4 rolls. Notice this almost falls in the middle. It's almost the midpoint of the line. And we would expect this. We would expect, most buyers are not compulsive. Most buyers are not neurotic about one product. You know, if you ran into a person and you said, "What do you like to eat?" and they said, "Potato chips," you said, but after you've eaten some potato chips, what do you like to eat? And they say, "Potato chips." You say, "Well, what do you like to eat for dinner?" "Potato chips." "What do you like to eat for breakfast?" "Potato chips." "What do you like to drink?" "I don't like to drink. I like to eat potato chips." If you talk to a person like that, you probably think there was something abnormal about them. They're compulsive. They're probably not right. If you want to use the term rational, they're probably not rational. So most consumers do not allocate their budget to one product. That's considered compulsivity. Most buyers are going to buy a combination of products. And if you look at this in the standpoint of this budget line, most people are going to operate somewhere in the middle of their budget line. This is called consumer equilibrium. Once a consumer gets to this point, the consumer is not going to want to leave this point. At this point, what happens? The buyer maximizes total utility, in this case, 4140. In our next lesson, we'll take a closer look at this concept of consumer equilibrium, and we'll look specifically at what happens if the consumer should move away from this point. But let's leave this lesson with this point, that buyers look for the combination of goods and services with a fixed budget and fixed prices that maximizes their total utility or total happiness.